To Spain today for pleasure. For the classic diversions of the Mediterranean South, sunlit, frivolous pleasures, full of life, love, and salt spray. Out of Spain yesterday, catastrophe. A tragedy so dreadful that the world stood aghast, and peering into the whirlpool of the Spanish Civil War, saw itself grotesquely and prophetically reflected there. This film is a memory of that catastrophe from its origins in the resplendent Spanish past to its fearful maturity, only yesterday in Spain. Madrid in the early years of the present century looked on the face of it ordinary enough. A city with most of the conveniences of the industrial era, some grand boulevards in the fashionable French manner, a parliament where the Spanish constitutional democracy conducted its affairs, even a motor car or two. On the face of it, Madrid looked ordinary and comfortable enough. Over this city's shoulder, though, lay the gaunt sierra of inner Spain, the most extraordinary and tremendous of hinterlands. It was this grave, poor countryside that had dictated the character of the nation down the centuries, and its almost medieval style of life bitterly reflected the long, melancholy decline of Spanish history. Four centuries before, Spain had been the most magnificent kingdom in Europe, with a vast empire in the Americas and a civilization of dazzling Christian certainty. But war after war had enfeebled and impoverished her, and she was now entering the 20th century chastened and confused, her dominions lost, her purpose corroded. All her proud buildings and pious treasures were no more than souvenirs, relics of a glorious past in one of Europe's poorest countries, whose splendor had long since faded. In the 20s, this disillusioned nation still had a king, Alfonso XIII, who came to the throne in 1906. Spain was racked with poverty and self-doubt, but Alfonso still went through the conventional royal motions, like going to sea with admirals on battleships. He was a relic, too, of the grand old Spain, inhabiting inner realms of wealth, inheritance, and ceremonial. He played properly aristocratic games with properly aristocratic friends. He had a properly stately mother on the sidelines. Around his throne there revolved a hierarchy of the well-born and the powerful, and the monarchy remained a focus for all the traditional forces of Spanish power. There was the officer corps of the army, a pageant of conservative and historical loyalties. There were the rich. They were often very rich, and frequently lived off the profits of vast estates in the backward south, which from the elegant delights of Madrid, they seldom visited from one year to the next. And binding all with mystic discipline, infusing all with archaic beauty, there was the Roman Catholic Church. Half the old glories of Spain had been Catholic glories, and with its weight, its age, its sanctity, and its awfulness, the Church retained a ritual fascination for the Spaniards. All these old powers of Spain seemed aloof to the miserable realities of the time and rode beside Alfonso in a gilded progress of nostalgia. But always over the shoulder, that other Spain, where there were no illusions. There lived people of a different kind, the strong and sober peasantry of Spain, trapped in poverty. Landless, illiterate, cruelly exploited by landlords and moneylenders, their material condition had hardly changed since the Middle Ages, before the Spanish glory even started. And out of their endless labor, a brooding discontent was growing. In the cities, it was already expressing itself in violence, and strikes and coups and political murders had become commonplace. Spain was fitfully embarking, though she didn't yet know it, upon a desperate series of political experiments, searching always for stability, prosperity, and above all, purpose. First, in 1923, she tried dictatorship. Primo de Rivera, the Spanish Mussolini, seized all power for himself and banned all political parties. He at least satisfied one perennial Spanish appetite, the taste for strong leadership. He was good at the things that most dictators are good at: building roads, creating images, spellbinding. He brought the 20s to Spain, and under his aegis the music really did, just for a few years, go round and round. But it was a false Charleston. The deeper discontents remained. The poverty actually worsened with the world slump of the 20s. In 1929, Primo de Rivera removed himself, and the Spaniards returned to democracy. Next, they tried republicanism. The national sense of failure and uncertainty was now turned against the monarchy, the sum of all that was old and traditional in Spain. Alfonso seemed more than ever remote behind his guards and palace railings. And soon the mobs were demanding his abdication. In April 1931, he agreed. "Until the nation speaks," he said, "I shall deliberately suspend the use of my royal prerogatives." But the nation didn't need to speak. Its decision was enacted unmistakably in the streets. So Spain rejected the last of her kings. England received Alfonso, and he disappeared from history through the grimy portals of Victoria Station. Now this was a republic, and to the people all felt new and fresh. For the first time they really seemed to rule themselves, and now they were going to see what up-to-date liberal republican democracy could do for their country. The first republican government was moderate, middle class, slightly left of centre, almost an archetype of intellectual liberalism between the wars. It was a reformist but not a revolutionary government. There were no Bolsheviks or fascists in it. It was, for all the exuberance of its supporters, thoroughly respectable. The first president of Spain, Alcálá Zamora, was installed in the king's old palace with a ceremony that stood reassuringly for Spanish continuity. If he and his ministers scarcely looked men of fire, at least they seemed to survey the masses below with earnest benevolence. But they had enemies down there from the start. When they began to whittle away the power of the church and the supremacy of the landed classes, they found that the old loyalties of Spain were stubbornly deep and the new aspirations alarmingly fierce. To men of the right, their reforms seemed the thin end of Bolshevism. To men of the left, they were milk and water stuff. So soon in the Republic's short history, behind the exhilaration, was the pattern of catastrophe taking shape. The problems of Spain seemed, after all, no less insoluble than they'd been under the king or the dictator. Land reform failed to cure the rural poverty that lay at the root of Spain's anxieties. The world slump depressed Spain as it depressed the rest of Europe. Unemployment rose. The value of money fell. The poor were as poor as ever. Nothing changed overnight, and Spain relapsed into frustration. The growing hatred between left and right exploded now in constant violence and was whipped into extra ferocity by the anarchists, a wild chorus to the Spanish drama. Anarchy in Spain was a powerfully organized political movement. To its supporters, the very existence of the state, any state, was immoral, and they pursued their principles with fearful enthusiasm, joyfully setting fire to official buildings and reserving a special venom for that old organ of universal authority, the church. The anarchists liked the Rococo style best because it burnt so merrily. So the government's ministers, surrounded still by the pomp of authority, felt their enemies assembling and knew perhaps that tragedy was on the way. They couldn't trust the military, jangling contemptuously all around them. They couldn't altogether trust the people, confused as they were by the rival ideologies of the day. Communism on the left, fascism on the right. They had affronted the monarchists, the churchmen, the landowners. From their exposed positions of power, they could sense on the one hand the terrible latent power of the mob, and on the other the scornful resentment of the reactionaries, whose earnest of threat was the army itself. But it was still a democracy, and at elections in the early 30s, the moderates precariously held on to power. But more and more, like their monarchist predecessors, they seemed to be detached from the passions of the people. They still talked the language of rational idealism, but emotions far more elemental were now to seize the Spanish public. Chaos was overtaking Spain, a monotony of chaos. The government tried to suppress it by ever harsher methods of interrogation and arrest. But the conflicting furies of the nation were beginning to ignore those men of the center in Madrid. In 1934, the miners of Asturias rebelled and seized half their province, but it was the army that put them down. This was no work for moderates. Asturias was treated as the territory of a defeated enemy, and all over the province shattered buildings were left as disciplinary reminders. The regionalism of Spain, the tendency of Asturians, Basques or Catalans to think of themselves as separate nations, was a traditional threat to the unity of Spain. The men of the old school knew how to deal with it. What's at the back of his mind, this busy, punitive general? Perhaps like so many right-wing Spaniards, he sees those miners as something worse than mere rebels. Outriders of anti-God, perhaps, or heralds of communism. Perhaps as his platoons tramp off, he's thinking that the old military virtues will still be needed, after all, to save the soul of Spain. For the liberal democratic experiment was failing fast. The extremists of left and right now flanked the centre in threatening coalitions. On one side, the Popular Front, discreetly managed by the communists. On the other, the Phalange, the new fascist party of Spain, Catholic and militarist. The wires of Spain were now fearfully crossed. The working people were inflamed. The Socialist Party was divided. Fanatics of several sorts raged around the country, inciting disorder and desecration. Neither right nor left paid even lip service to the sanctity of the Republic and its institutions. And somewhere behind all this destruction and recrimination, a group of army generals were plotting a revolution. Experiment number 4. Now that ordinary Madrid of 30 years before was ordinary no more. On July the 12th, 1936, a government police officer was murdered. Next day, in retaliation, 3 policemen called upon Calvo Sotelo, the chief spokesman of the right, forced him into a car, shot him twice in the back of the neck, and left his corpse at the municipal cemetery. The moment had arrived. It was as though a bell had tolled. For a day or two, Spain, noble Spain, the Spain of Cervantes, El Greco and Goya, seemed to hold back from the catastrophe abhorred. And then on July 17th, 1936, the army conspirators rose in revolution, and the Spanish Civil War began. Madrid, the capital of the Republican government, became the stronghold of an ideal. The enemy was fascist in everything but name. The government formed by the Popular Front became by reflex the champion of everything radical. To the Republican standards flocked the workers and the idealists, honoring fiery convictions of universal brotherhood. They had few weapons and almost no trained officers. But they were desperately ready to cock their rifles if they could and die for their principles if they must. On the other side, the army rebels were backed by the church, the Phalange, and almost the entire officer corps. They claimed to stand for everything that was sacred and traditional in Spain. They called themselves the Nationalists, and their first leader was a General Emilio Mola, a short-sighted officer of literary tastes. Behind him, though, a more formidable general was already preparing himself for the command. Francisco Franco, shrewd, tight, secretive, was a Galician from the north of Spain. A calculating man, 44 years old, the son of a naval paymaster, and already eagerly looking forward to the opportunities of power. Most of Spain remained loyal to the Republicans, the government. But much of the centre declared for the rebel nationalists, and within a week they had spectacularly implanted their cause in the south by capturing Seville. This opening coup was achieved by the stunning audacity of one man, Queipo de Llano. Almost alone, he arrested the garrison commander and bullied, jollied, and bluffed the rest of the garrison into joining the nationalists. In no time, Seville, the fourth city of Spain, was his. The general's real objective, though, was Madrid. Madrid was Spain, and almost at once the rebel armies prepared to march upon the capital. The Republicans, for their part, knew that if they could hold Madrid, they'd won the first round. The revolution could at least be prolonged into a war. Gradually and painfully, their raggle-taggle armies prepared themselves. They were hoping to get weapons from abroad, but none had yet arrived, and most of the forces in Madrid were pitifully makeshift. Each political party had its own militia, and already the hard core of the defense was the Communist regiment. With its political commissars and its Russian-trained officers, this was an ambitious and disciplined shock force, an ominous Praetorian Guard for the Democrats of the government. The outer defences of Madrid were in the Guadarrama mountains to the northwest. In this harsh country were fought the first proper battles of the war, the first battles in effect between fascism and communism and their respective allies. Fighting was vicious from the start on a scale not seen since the end of the First World War nearly 20 years before. No quarter was given by either side. Most prisoners were killed. But the line held, and the nationalists were checked in the mountains. Madrid was for the moment saved, and it became clear that the Spanish Civil War was going to be nasty, brutish, and long. But the nationalist rebels were gaining ground. They were halted before Madrid, but in the north they advanced on Irun, near the French frontier, to isolate the staunchly Republican northerners around Bilbao. Up there, professionalism was telling. By the end of August 1936, the nationalists had reached the French frontier and were besieging Irun. This was a first rehearsal of more ghastly performances to come. And here all the horrors later to become familiar to half the world were played out upon a small piece of territory in one distant corner of Spain. Here were the sad extras of the drama tumbling across the frontier bridge to France in safety. Here were the passions of the barricades. Here were the bombers, the first of so many. It only took 4 days to reduce the time. On September the 2nd, the first Republican soldiers took to their boats and fled across the river into France. Next day, the defense collapsed, and the people of Irun, soldiers and civilians, grabbed what they could and crossed the frontier. First refugees of Spain. Behind them, their homes in flames and their cause precarious. In the nationalist capital of Burgos, General Franco was, step by step, pursuing his ambitions towards supreme power. Already he was beginning to be a name and a half-familiar face to the people of Spain and to the governments of the world. Now, as the first bombs fell upon Madrid, the people could tell that greater powers far away were interesting themselves in Spain. As the agony mounted, most of the powers signed a non-intervention agreement, but some of them didn't really mean it. The extremist powers, Germany and Italy on the one side, Russia on the other, saw their own ideologies burning away in there and began to stoke the fires. Russian generals arrived to help the Republicans. German and Italian aircraft flew in to blast Madrid for the nationalists. So the symbolism of the Spanish Civil War rose towering above the conflict. The innocence of Spain were the innocence of all Europe, and the pathos of Spain was a symptom of the whole world's sickness. It was the cruelest of wars, the most unforgiving. All too often, the prisoners of war, however young, meek, and terrified, were taken out of view only to be killed. But to General Franco, it was a crusade against atheist communism, a holy war, and with him marched the most powerful of all Spanish divisions, the Catholic Church. Thousands of priests and monks had been murdered or executed by the other side, and now the Church was mobilized in angry splendor to take its revenge. No such unearthly battalions supported the Republicans, but in September 1936 the Communists officially joined the administration and elegant Madrid became a proletarian capital. To men of the left everywhere, it became more than ever emblematic of the socialist and fascist cause. Madrid awaited the next nationalist assault austerely. Short of food, short of water, short of color, but with a grey patience. But the assault was unexpectedly delayed. 40 miles south of Madrid lay Toledo, the illustrious repository of everything most Spanish in Spain. Toledo was held by the government, but inside its central fortress, the Alcázar, some 2,000 nationalists were holding out against almost ludicrous odds. They were entirely surrounded. They were bombed, shelled and dynamited night and day, and they had no communication at all with their higher command. General Franco, now in effective strategic command, impulsively diverted his main striking force from the attack on Madrid to the relief of this heroic little force. As his troops advanced towards the city, the men in the fortress had eaten the last of their livestock, sparing only, in high Spanish style, one thoroughbred racehorse, which they kept immaculately groomed throughout it all. On September the 27th, Franco's relieving forces cut their way into the center of Toledo, killing all prisoners as they went, for the glory of God and Spain. The Republican defense collapsed, and next morning there was nobody to shoot at the nationalist flag when they ran it up in triumph above the Alcázar. It was an allegorical success, a Spanish gesture such as a bullfight crowd would understand. And to set a seal upon it, General Franco himself hastened to Toledo. Less Spanish generals might have preferred to attack Madrid while the capital's defenses were so weak. But Franco had deliberately thrown away that chance. In return, he had a glorious tale to tell, the kind of tale that would one day mature into a legend of Spanish chivalry. Nothing to report, the fortress commander laconically declared, when he paraded his heroes and his horse at the end of this Castilian epic. And out of these exploits there did emerge one storybook champion. On October the 1st, 1936 in Burgos, Franco was declared El Caudillo, head of state, and assumed the cloak of power with an assurance that was almost swashbuckling. Spain burnt and wept around him. In Madrid, the greater issues of the war were now all too apparent. If the Republican capital fell, not only would Franco and his nationalists rule all Spain, but the fascist dictators of Germany and Italy, growing more arrogant every year, would feel that they were one stage nearer the domination of Europe. "I would rather destroy Madrid," Franco had said, "than leave it to the Marxists." "This is Madrid," cried the government radio in reply. "It's fighting for Spain, for humanity, for justice, and with the mantle of its blood it shelters all human beings." Volunteers rushed in from all over the world to help in the defense of the capital, and the international brigades were now the strongest units in Madrid. Their men were mostly communist, at least in the visionary sense that so many young men were communist in the 30s. There were Germans, Frenchmen, Italians, Belgians, Poles, a British machine gun section, and a nephew of Winston Churchill. They thought they were fighting for the dignity of man. Outside Madrid, they were now supported by Russian tanks with Russian drivers sent to Spain by that scourge of the human spirit, Joseph Stalin. In Burgos, Franco was already lapped in victorious circumstances. In the first week of November 1936, he confidently ordered General Varela, his field commander, to storm Madrid. "20,000 nationalist soldiers launched the attack, mostly Moroccans and foreign legionnaires brought in from Spanish North Africa. They were openly supported by German and Italian aircraft, and they planned to drive clean through the western suburbs into the center of Madrid. By strangely assorted forces of socialism, foreign volunteers, trade union militias, political party battalions, a column of anarchists, Russian armor, and the vast inchoate mass of the Madrid working classes. Once more, to everybody's astonishment, this hodgepodge of an army won. The nationalists penetrated the suburbs, but they were bogged down in the complex of buildings called the University City, the pride of pre-war Spain, but now already half ruined. For 2 weeks a fierce battle was fought amongst these skeleton halls of learning, but the impetus of the attack fizzled out, and on November the 23rd, Franco called it off. But there were many, many miseries to come. Spain was now the obsession of Europe. Poets sang more lyrically of this tragedy than they'd sung since Rupert Brooke's war, and generals saw Spain as a proving ground, where one could test the effects of total war upon, who else? The Spaniards. The ministers of the Republican government had left Madrid for Valencia. There they anxiously debated the problems of supply. No arms were coming to either side from the liberal powers, Britain, France, the United States. Germany and Italy were openly sending supplies to Franco, but virtually the only Republican source of weapons was Soviet Russia. Republican cause was thus tied more closely to communism with each Soviet supply ship. The Russians, though, were not prepared to risk a European war for Spain. They had troubles of their own at home, and as those vital crates were hoisted ashore in Spain, there was even then occurring one of the most ferocious purges in the whole of Russian history. The Germans were more assured. General Franco seemed to be just their man. They formally recognized his regime as the only government of Spain and sent a suitably regimental ambassador to Burgos. This moment, Franco declared, marks the peak of life in the world. His brother Raymond went off to Rome to get more help there. Italy, as Franco carefully remarked in a speech one day, was a bulwark of culture, civilization, and Christianity. And sure enough, Mussolini was already helping him with several thousand soldiers and regular shipments of arms. Inside Spain, meanwhile, the war was being fought with almost insane ferocity. From the start, zealots of both sides had executed or imprisoned anybody who might conceivably be an enemy to their own beliefs. People were killed simply because they were rich, or priests, or communists, or prisoners of war. And one man was killed because he was José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the founder of the Falangist movement, and thus the principal fascist of Spain. Malaga was Franco's next prize on the southern coast. When the new year opened, 1937, the nationalists launched a violent attack on the port with German and Italian help. Everything went their way. Their cruisers bombarded the coast unopposed. Their infantry, grandly commanded by the Duke of Seville, assaulted the city from inland, supported by Italian tanks. This was no Madrid. Few citizens manned the barricades in Malaga. On February the 8th, the city ignominiously fell. Out of this ruined city, as from many another, labored the long lines of the dispossessed, now the familiars of Spain. By March 1937, Franco's nationalists held all the western half of Spain except for an important slab along the northern coast. There the Basques, almost an independent nation now, still held out for the Republic. Madrid was still under siege. Malaga had fallen. The nationalists now advanced on Bilbao. They soon took it. But in the course of the campaign, something hideous happened. The town most sacred to the Basque people was chosen by Franco's German allies as a suitable target for their dive bombers. And so they gave the world a new name for its gazetteer of cruelty, Guernica. Guernica was the ancient home of Basque liberties, and in 3 hours on April the 26th, 1937, its heart was ripped out. It was the first of the obliteration raids. And 20 years later, Goering himself admitted that for the Nazis, Guernica had been an experiment in new techniques of blitzkrieg. Spain and the world have never forgotten Guernica, but that brief, exact atrocity symbolized the intervention of foreign people, and foreign ideas in the affairs of Spain. For so long isolated in simplicity behind their Pyrenees, now at last the Spaniards were embroiled again in the vendettas of Europe. The winter of 1937 was cruel, and the first fall of despondency settled upon the Republicans. The Communists were struggling with the Socialists for supreme power in the Republic, and seen against a background of personal dejection and political infighting, the Republican cause seemed to be losing its flame. Not so los otros, the others, already striking the attitudes of success. The mystic militarism of Catholic Spain found its apotheosis in Franco's neo-fascist state. The Phalange was now a mass movement, and General Franco had already announced his plans for his particular kind of autocracy. It was going to be a vertical state, an imprecise conception in which the one certainty seemed to be that General Franco would unquestionably be at the top of it. His armies advanced almost everywhere. A desolate trail was laid for them by the Condor Legion, the Nazi combined operations force in Spain, whose bomber pilots were now the most experienced in the world. By the spring of 1938, the Germans had 270 aircraft in Spain. In theory, their presence was still secret, and it was a criminal offense to talk about them in Germany. In practice, there was no escaping them. Without Russian help, the Republicans must have collapsed. And by now, the images of Soviet communism were everywhere in Republican Spain. The fanatic resolution of communism and the flow of arms from Russia alone kept the cause alive. Sometimes, even now, the old enthusiasm of the working classes, the original innocence of the popular purpose, flickered and glowed once again, took the grandmothers loyally into the trenches, and kept the weary soldiers at their rifles. In July 1938, the Republicans gathered their strength for one last great offensive across the Ebro River, on the western edge of Catalonia. $100,000 men were committed to this campaign, a quarter of the total government forces. They were led by units of the international brigades and commanded by communist generals. At first the attack went well, and several bridgeheads were established on the right bank of the river. Nationalists sent in heavy reinforcements. Franco himself hastened to the front, but for 3 months the Republicans held on to what they had won. At the end of October, Franco counterattacked in force, with overwhelming superiority in aircraft and tanks. even then, the Republicans held on tenaciously for 2 more weeks in the rugged, roadless country above the river. Why, one wonders, when the effort was likely to cripple them for good. Perhaps they hoped to force a negotiated peace out of Franco. Czechoslovakia had just been dismembered by the Munich Agreement, and perhaps they feared that if the Republic showed signs of collapsing now, Hitler and Chamberlain might propose some similar solution for Spain. Or perhaps they grimly hoped that if they fought on long enough, the Spanish War might be swallowed up anywhere in the general war that was soon to engulf Europe. Whatever the reason, the Republicans threw almost everything into the Ebro battle. It was their last card, bravely played. When it was trumped, the world knew that the war was nearly over. Up through Catalonia, the victorious nationalists now advanced in the first weeks of 1939. The Republic was now half-starving, but Franco's troops did not really come as liberators. It was too late for forgiveness. The bread was welcome, but there was revenge in the air as well. And for many an innocent citizen, the relief was tainted with fear. The end was near. The nationalists now said an emotional goodbye to some of the Italians who'd come to help them.
Duce! Duce! Viva Italia! Viva el Rey Emperador! Viva Mussolini!
Mussolini once remarked that his atlas had been open at the map of Spain for 3 years. It was high time to turn the pages. No doubt the Italians felt that they'd done something for their gimcrack fascist cause. 50,000 of them had fought in Spain. 6,000 died there. They went home heroes. And it was another few months before the Duce, consulting his atlas once more, threw the poor devils into Albania. On the other side, the Republicans were saying goodbye to the international brigades. Their volunteers were dispersing to homes all over the world. They'd come from 60 nations, and at least 8,000 men had been killed on the Spanish battlefields. But for all too many of those young men, showered though they were with gratitude, their cause too, the cause of international communism, was to turn sour in time. On January the 26th, 1939, Franco's forces entered Barcelona, the last seat of the Republican government. There was little resistance. The government itself had fled to France. Franco's men were welcomed only by those who had secretly supported the nationalists all along, and who now hesitantly note, with a fascist salute to the raising of the sacred host, emblematic of the new order, half pagan, half Catholic, which was soon to govern Spain. Now the Germans could go too. They would soon be needed elsewhere. At least 14,000 men had fought with the Condor Legion, and they went on to greater things. Von Thoma, who had commanded the tanks, distinguished himself under Rommel in North Africa. And von Sperl, who had directed the attack on Guernica, presently applied the same skills to Coventry and to Rotterdam. For the Nazis, the conflict had been a most successful curtain raiser, even ending happily. But for the poor Republican armies in Catalonia, it was curtains down. In the first week of February, 250,000 ragged, despondent and bewildered soldiers presented themselves at the French frontier posts in the Pyrenees, to be reluctantly admitted into France. Altogether, 400,000 refugees from Spain entered France and were settled in crude, cold camps. Nobody wanted them. Their once brave republic with all the hopes it had seemed to offer poor men everywhere, no longer existed. And sometimes all they brought with them into exile was a handful of the soil of Spain, the only pledge of their identity. Madrid, which had fought first, fell last. The old heroic unity had disintegrated in the end, and Alfonso's once comfortable capital was starving and leaderless. 2 years after their first assault upon the city, the nationalists crossed the Manzanares River at last and reached the heart of Spain. Now General Franco was undisputed master of the Spaniards. He joined the company of the great dictators, and in his hands lay the future of his country. Half a million Spaniards had been killed, but there was no humility to his posture now. Mercy, pity, reconciliation were not his watchwords. Behind his armies everywhere went the prosecutors, ready to take a legal revenge upon the defeated. While nationalist Spain celebrated, saluted by her fascist friends, thousands of Republicans were disappearing into political prisons, many of them never to be seen again. Spain was to be reborn. The glories of her past would be recreated in a new image. Spain triumphant, Spain resurgent. But in 1939, half the Spaniards, it seemed, were much more Spanish than the others. And so the Spanish catastrophe came to an end on April the 1st, 1939. The tortured fugue resolved itself, and an era of Spain closed. As the world stumbled on towards its own wider tragedy, Spain withdrew into herself, mutilated, embittered, paralyzed still in attitudes of shock and disbelief. She had been a platform for a passion play, in which the beliefs of more than one false creed could express themselves in courage, compassion, and ferocity. She'd always seemed a special sort of country, theatrically posturing there across the Pyrenees. But now her own extremes of character had made her special in a different sense. The Spaniards had shown themselves merciless, vindictive, and blind. But they had behaved, too, with such noble resolutions, such fire, such dignity, that even now the story of the Spanish Civil War can tug uncomfortably at the conscience and summon a tear across the years. And what kind of a Spain has General Franco built upon that wreck of a republic? He's ruled all Spain now for a quarter of a century, and he has given her peace. He shrewdly kept her out of the Second World War, resisting all Hitler's reproaches, and with an iron hand, he has restrained the passions of the Spaniards. But the irony of his success is this, that out of a crusade dedicated to the sacred grandeur of his country, he has constructed a new Spain, more ordinary than ever before. He's making of it a material, middle-class civilization like any other, still a long way behind by the standards of the West, but recognizably concerned with prosaic things like production rates and levels of income. No proud standards flutter on the Spanish trains. Style gives way to common sense. General Franco has done something at last to modernize the Spanish countryside and relieve the rural discontent which has brooded between every line of our story. You wouldn't always know it, for the country poverty of Spain can still be a dreadful thing to see. But there are bold things being done there. Dams, irrigation schemes, afforestation, and in places they are beginning to show. Franco has reconciled Spain with most of the world outside. By accepting arms and aid from the United States and allowing the Americans to have bases in Spain, he brought an outcast state, blackened with fascism, half back into the comity of the nations. Liberals the world over may still detest him, but he himself, the rebel general, now moves among the kings as to the manner born. He has outlasted and outgrown his squalid fascist peers, and nowadays he's halfway to royalty himself. But beneath this apparently interminable dictatorship, there is growing up a generation that does not remember Franco's crusade. To the Caudillo and his kind, the first aim has been to prevent more bloodshed in Spain, to prevent it at any cost in political freedom. Franco's government remains a severe despotism. You might perhaps reconcile such a regime with the character of the old Spain, so preoccupied with ancient matters of honor, revenge, and sacrifice. The instability of pre-war Spain, the savageries of the Civil War, seem to show that a despot was needed in Madrid. But the world has changed since 1939, and so willy-nilly has Spain. New ideas of liberty and opportunity have crept in anywhere. Already the students are beginning to demonstrate, the publishers to protest, even the priests to agitate for liberty. It's hard to see the younger Spaniards putting up with autocracy for long, once the Caudillo has passed on to yet more vertical domains. Then we shall have the fascination of seeing yet another new Spain. Perhaps it'll be a monarchy once more. Perhaps it'll experiment with democracy again. Whatever its form, its driving values will be those of the material West, down to earth and acquisitive. No forlorn but majestic Don Quixotes are likely to ride again through the traffic jams of the Spanish cities. The tomb of the Cid is locked. History may be, after all, respectful to General Franco. At least he has achieved a kind of anti-heroism. Out of catastrophe, he's brought forth concrete. And yet there hangs still over the peninsula a cloud, a breath of those brave and terrible happenings long ago. So many dead men sleep there still. So many hopes have crumbled in that soil. And from the rocks of Spain, the message seems to come more clearly, more hauntingly than anywhere. Never again, brothers. Never again.